Before starting the video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to support my channel because what I am going to tell you tonight was the most terrifying event of my life. My name is Adrian. I am 29 years old, and as I tell this now, I still cannot sleep at night because even if you physically leave some places, your soul never truly exits. I grew up in a small village. My childhood was spent among muddy roads, old stone houses, and silent evenings where no one wandered the streets at night. But I never felt like I belonged in that village because even though people looked normal, I always had a feeling deep down that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it as a child, but as I grew up, I realized that feeling had turned into fear. That's why I thought my life changed the day I passed the university entrance exam, because I was finally leaving that village. The first year I moved to the city was the best period of my life because, for the first time, I felt truly free. No one knew me, no one knew my past, and I was trying to leave my past behind. I was studying architecture at the university, and I enjoyed watching people more than the lessons because everyone in the city had a different story. One day I saw her in the campus library. Her name was Alina. She had blonde hair, spoke calmly, but always carried a constant thought in her eyes. Our first conversation started ordinarily, but we soon got used to each other because we were both lonely people. Over time, friendship turned into a relationship. We started living together before graduation and got married a few years later. My life finally seemed normal. I had a good job, I had a beautiful wife, and then our son was born. We named him Daniel because Alina said this name had a reassuring side to it, but looking back now, I think even that name was chosen like destiny because everything started after Daniel was born. A few months after my son was born, I started having strange dreams at night. I was seeing my old village, the roads I walked as a child, the dry tree next to the cemetery, people I hadn't seen in years. But the worst part of the dreams wasn't that. It was that all of them were looking at me, as if they were waiting for me to return. Every morning I would wake up in a cold sweat, but I didn't tell Alina because I didn't want to seem ridiculous. I had already tried not to think about the village for years. I rarely even spoke to my family because the further I stayed from there, the safer I felt. Then one night, my phone rang. It was 01:13 a.m. and my mother's name appeared on the screen. It wasn't normal for her to call at this hour because my mother didn't even like using the phone at night. I got a bad feeling and answered immediately. For a few seconds, I heard only the sound of breathing. Then my mother's voice came, but it was very weak, as if she were ill. "Adrian," she said. Because of the trembling in her voice, I sat up in bed. I had never heard her like this in my entire life. "Are you okay?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She was silent for a few seconds, then spoke very slowly. "These might be my last days. I want to see you, my daughter-in-law, and my grandson." This sentence created heavy guilt inside me because I hadn't visited them in years. While building a new life in the city, I had completely left my old life behind, and now my mother was saying she was about to die. I couldn't speak for a few seconds because I didn't know what to say. "Alina and I will come," I said finally. My mother took a deep breath. Then she said something very strange. "Be late." She hung up. At that moment, an unexplainable restlessness formed inside me because my mother's voice wasn't normal. It wasn't just that she sounded sick, she sounded scared. I sat with the phone in my hand for a few minutes. Then Alina woke up and looked at my face. "What happened?" she asked. I told her my mother was sick, but I don't know why, even as I spoke, something felt missing, as if there was a wrong detail in that phone conversation that my mind hadn't caught yet. The next day I didn't go to work because I was constantly thinking about my mother. Eventually, I talked to Alina and we decided to go to the village over the weekend. Alina had never seen my village before, but she agreed so as not to upset me. Daniel was only 3 years old and saw the idea of a journey as a game. While preparing that night, I took out my old photo albums because I wanted to show Alina my childhood. But the moment I opened the album, my hand stopped because I noticed something very strange in a photo I hadn't looked at in years. In the photo, there were people standing in the village square. My mother and father were among them. But everyone's gaze was turned not toward the camera, but toward the person taking the photo. As I held the photo in my hand, my restlessness turned into something I had never felt before, because in a normal family photo, people are supposed to look at the camera, but here it was different. They were all focused on the same point, as if the person taking the photo wasn't someone they knew, but something they should fear. I looked at the photo for a few seconds because my brain was trying to find a logical explanation for it, but it couldn't. When Alina came over and looked at the album, she noticed the expression on my face. "What happened?" she asked. I showed her the photo, but she didn't see anything strange at first glance because it looked ordinary from the outside, just an old village photo. But I recognized those looks because I had seen them many times as a child. It was how people looked when they heard sounds coming from outside at night, with fear, but also as if they were used to it. "Alina," I said slowly, "our village is a bit strange." Even as I said this, I couldn't fully explain what I meant because during my childhood, the things that happened in the village were never spoken of openly. People wouldn't leave their houses on certain nights. They would pray while passing in front of certain houses. Some children would suddenly disappear, but the next day everyone would act as if nothing had happened. When I was little, I thought these things were normal because I hadn't seen another life. But after spending years in the city, I realized that they weren't normal. Alina smiled slightly because she perceived what I said as a village legend. "Every village has strange story," she said, "but the things in my village were not stories. I would understand this years later." We set out the next morning. The weather was overcast and the sky was full of gray clouds. Daniel was playing with his toys in the back seat. Alina had turned on music on her phone, but for some reason I was uneasy. As we got closer to the village, fears I thought I had forgotten for years were returning. As we moved away from the city, the roads began to narrow, the buildings disappeared, replaced by forests, and as we entered the region where my childhood was spent, my memory began to bring back unwanted details. When I was little, it was forbidden for us to go outside after 9 o'clock every evening. My father would lock the doors twice. My mother would close the curtains completely. And some nights, I would hear the sound of something walking outside the house. When these memories flooded my mind, I gripped the steering wheel tighter because I didn't want Alina or Daniel to be afraid, but at the same time I was thinking of turning back. A voice inside me was saying this was a bad idea. Just then Daniel spoke from the back seat. "Dad," he said. His voice wasn't normal, he sounded distracted. I looked at him through the rearview mirror. He was looking out the window. "What is it, son?" I asked. He pointed toward the forest with his small finger. "Someone was walking there," he said. Alina laughed softly. "He probably saw a tree shadow," she said. But I didn't laugh because the moment I looked in the direction Daniel was pointing, I could have sworn I saw a movement among the trees. A black silhouette seemed to have stood among the trees for a few seconds, but then it disappeared. I thought about braking, but I didn't because my logic told me it was just an optical illusion. As the road stretched on, the phone signal began to drop, and this bothered me even more because our last link with the city was breaking. A few hours later, we finally entered the village road, and at that moment an indescribable weight formed inside me because nothing had changed. The same old houses, the same stone roads, the same silence, but this silence wasn't normal. The sounds that should be in a village were missing. There were no children's voices, no animal sounds, even the wind seemed weaker. "Alina," I said slowly, "isn't it strange?" She looked around too. "It's a bit too quiet," she said. When we reached the village square, we saw a few people, but they were all watching us. No one was smiling, no one was approaching. They were just looking, and those gazes brought back the memories of my childhood because I had forgotten those looks. This is how people looked when they were afraid. I stopped the car in front of my parents' house. The old stone house was still the same. The windows were closed, the curtains were drawn. As I walked toward the door, my heart raced because the bad feeling inside me had now become very strong. I paused for a few seconds, then knocked. Footsteps came from inside, and the door slowly opened. My father was standing before me, but the expression on his face when he saw me wasn't joy, it was fear. "Adrian," he whispered. Then his eyes moved to Alina and Daniel, and his face went completely pale. He said very slowly, "Why did you come?" The fear on my father's face didn't change for a few seconds because at that moment, he seemed like he didn't want to see me. This feeling created a strange void inside me because I thought my family, whom I hadn't seen for years, had missed me. But the man standing in front of me looked as if he were witnessing a disaster occur. Alina had noticed this too. She slowly approached and touched my arm. "Adrian, are you okay?" she said, but I couldn't answer because my eyes were still on my father. "Where is Mom?" I said finally. My father was silent for a few seconds, then he turned his head very slowly, looked into the dark corridor of the house, and even this movement created a bad feeling because it was as if there was someone inside who shouldn't hear. "Inside," he said quietly, then he looked at me again. "Who notified you?" The moment I heard this question, a weight settled in my stomach because my most feared possibility was now becoming real. I didn't say anything for a few seconds because my brain was still trying to put this into a logical place but couldn't. "My mother called," I said finally. My father's face completely changed at that moment. His eyes widened, his lips trembled. And in that moment, I saw for the first time that he was truly afraid. He said again, "Your mother didn't call you." This sentence made my whole body turn cold because he wasn't lying when he said it. I knew my father well enough. He was afraid and this fear was real. Alina looked at me. The expression on her face was confused because she didn't understand what was happening either. "Maybe you're misremembering," she said, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. I said immediately, "I spoke with my mother's voice." Father was silent for a few seconds. Then he quickly looked outside, checked the village square, and without opening the door any further, he pulled us inside. Then he slammed the door shut and locked it. This movement was so sudden that Daniel got scared and clung to Alina's leg. The house was as I had left it in my childhood, but at the same time it felt different because there was a heavy smell inside, like a mixture of old wood, dampness, and something burnt. The living room light was weak and all the curtains were closed. Inside the house, there was a darkness like night even during the day. My mother came out of the kitchen. The moment I saw her, I felt guilt because she had truly grown thin. Her face had collapsed and most of her hair had turned white. But what scared me wasn't her appearance, it was her eyes. In my mother's eyes, there was a fear that constantly drifted toward the door, as if she didn't feel safe even inside the house. I thought she would hug me when she saw me, but she didn't. First, she looked at Daniel. She looked for a long time. Then her eyes filled with tears. "God," she whispered. This reaction wasn't normal because a grandmother wouldn't act this way when she saw her grandson for the first time. This was a fear that resembled sadness. Alina had noticed this because she pulled Daniel a bit closer to herself. I said slowly, "Didn't you call us?" My mother's face went completely pale at that moment. She shook her head immediately. She said, "I haven't used a phone for days." That moment, the silence inside the house became unbearable because it was no longer a matter of misunderstanding. Someone had called me with my mother's voice, and the thing doing this knew everything about my family. "Alina," I said slowly, "show the phone." Alina immediately took the phone out of her bag because I had saved the number after the conversation. I opened the screen and showed the recent calls, but at that moment the fear inside me grew even larger because there was no call. The number had completely disappeared, as if I had never been called. "This isn't possible," I whispered. My father sat on a chair because his face had now completely collapsed. "They summoned you," he said very slowly. This sentence echoed inside me. "Who?" I said immediately. My father didn't answer. My mother, on the other hand, suddenly stood up and went to the window because a slight sound had come from outside. Her being this scared had made Alina uneasy too, because now everyone in this house was afraid of something invisible. Finally, my father spoke. "The village has changed," he said. "Children have been disappearing since winter began." That moment, the air in the room changed because this sentence wasn't like an ordinary horror story. My father lowered his eyes while telling this because he didn't even want to think about what he had experienced again. "What do you mean, disappearing?" I asked. Before answering, my father looked at the door, then lowered his voice even further. "Some follow the sounds they hear at night, and some aren't in their beds in the morning." Alina immediately took Daniel in her arms because it was now completely obvious that the situation was not ordinary. "Didn't you notify the police?" she asked, but my father laughed bitterly. "The police came," he said. "They never returned." This sentence destroyed the last sense of security inside the room because now this event wasn't just the fear of the village people. Even people coming from the outside were disappearing. At that moment, the sound of a dog came from outside. But this wasn't a normal bark. It was more like a long scream, as if it were in pain. Daniel started crying because the sound was truly terrifying. My mother immediately began reciting prayers, and this image took me back to my childhood because she used to do the same thing on certain nights when I was little. I didn't understand why back then, but now I did. My father suddenly stood up. "Turn off the lights," he said sharply. Alina looked at me in shock, but I turned off the lamp without any objection because at that moment, my old fears had returned. The house was plunged into total darkness. Only the moonlight from outside seeped very faintly through the edges of the curtains. Then, a sound came from outside, a woman's voice, a very familiar voice. "Alina," it was whispering. Alina froze because the voice was her mother's voice. The color completely drained from Alina's face the moment she heard that voice because a person recognizes certain voices no matter where they are in the world. She had recognized her mother's voice, but she knew this was impossible because her mother was in the city and it wasn't possible for her to come here. Despite this, that voice was outside, right in front of the house, whispering in the darkness. "Alina." This time it was heard more clearly. Daniel stopped crying because he was listening to the voice too. I believe that children feel some things faster than adults, and the expression on my son's face at that moment reminded me of this again, because rather than being afraid, it was as if he were paying close attention. "Alina." Mother immediately grabbed Alina's arm. "Don't you dare look outside," she said in a whisper. There was such intense fear in this sentence that Alina recoiled instinctively because my mother was truly in a panic. My father went to the corner of the living room and took his old shotgun, and this movement increased the tension inside me even more because my father was a man who hated using weapons his entire life. Seeing him with a shotgun in his hand was inherently wrong. "Dad," I said quietly. "What is this?" My father didn't answer because his eyes were on the door, listening intently as if he could see the thing outside. Then he spoke very slowly. "First, they call out," he said, with the voice of someone you know. With this sentence, a memory I had tried to forget from my childhood suddenly came back to my mind. When I was 8 years old, I had heard my grandfather's voice outside the house one night. My grandfather was in another city at the time, but I was sure I had heard that voice. I had wanted to go out, but my mother had stopped me and didn't let me leave my room until morning. The next day, I had learned that a child from the village had disappeared, but for years I had thought it was a coincidence. Now, everything was taking on a different meaning. The voice outside continued for a few minutes. Sometimes it spoke like Alina's mother, sometimes like an old woman, and sometimes it cried. But the scariest part was this. The voice was never quite human because it said some words incorrectly, as if something outside was imitating speech. Then, it suddenly stopped. When silence returned, everyone in the room began to breathe because it was as if we had all been holding our breath for a few minutes. Daniel had put his head on Alina's shoulder, but his eyes were still looking at the door. "What is this thing?" I said finally because I wanted to learn the truth now. My father sat back on the chair and put his face in his hands because even talking seemed to cause him pain. "They were here when we were children too," he said finally. "They used to be weaker." With this sentence, the fear inside me went to another level because the word "they" indicated that these things were not alone. "Who are they?" I asked. My father raised his eyes. "Jinn," he said directly. Alina said nothing, but the expression on her face showed that she also now understood this was not an ordinary village fear. "For years, there was a pact in this village," my father said. "The old people kept certain things under seal, but last winter someone broke that seal." "Seal?" I asked. My father nodded. "The old tunnels under the village." Moment I heard this word, another memory from my childhood came back because there was a closed stone door behind the cemetery when I was little, and everyone in the village told us not to go near it. No one would explain why, but stories circulated among the children that it was built for the people under the ground. One night, my father said, a few young people from the village went inside. Trembling in his voice increased. They returned the next day, but they weren't alone. Air inside the living room grew heavy because as my father told this, his eyes widened with fear, as if he were reliving that moment. Then children started disappearing, he said. First one, then two, then another one every month. Alina, I whispered, because now the terrifying possibility in my mind had become clear. They had summoned us here. And the target was Daniel. Right at that moment, Daniel suddenly raised his head. His face was expressionless. His eyes were looking at the corner of the living room. "That man is here again," he said in a calm voice. My blood ran cold because there was no one in the corner of the room. "Alina," I said, trembling, "ask Daniel what he is saying." Pulled our son to herself. "Which man, sweetie?" she asked, but Daniel continued to look at the same spot without taking his eyes off it. "The tall one," he said, "one with black eyes." That moment, my mother began to cry because that description was the same as the thing that had been told in the village for years. My father stood up. "They see him," he whispered. "Children always see them." Just as he said that, a heavy sound came from the upper floor of the house, as if someone were walking slowly. Everyone froze because there was supposed to be no one upstairs. Another step came, the old floorboards creaked. Then very slowly, a child's voice was heard. "Mom!" The voice of that child coming from upstairs instantly changed the atmosphere inside the house because it wasn't normal. The moment I heard it, I knew it wasn't Daniel's voice, but at the same time, it wasn't entirely foreign. It was as if someone was trying to imitate a child's voice but couldn't quite succeed. There was a strange hollowness in the sound, something deeply unsettling. "Mom." It came more clearly this time. Alina instinctively hugged Daniel tighter because she was terrified now too. My father stood motionless, his shotgun aimed toward the upper floor. The expression on his face brought back the fear I remembered from my childhood because, for the first time in years, I saw him looking truly helpless. "Don't go up," he said quietly. But at that exact moment, the same voice was heard for the third time. "Mom, I'm cold." This time the voice was tearful and piercing because it was consciously trying to evoke pity. My mother covered her ears and began to pray, while Alina looked at me with the same question in her eyes. Was there really someone upstairs? I was thinking the same thing, but there was another feeling inside me as well, because the moment I heard that voice, a memory I wanted to forget from my childhood flashed back into my mind. I was 9 years old, and one night I had heard a child crying from upstairs. My mother had locked me in my room and didn't let me out until morning. The next day, I learned that a baby had gone missing in the village. Now the same thing was happening again, and this time the target was my son. "What does this thing want?" I asked, because I was now feeling more anger than fear. My father paused for a few seconds before answering. "The children," he said finally, "the little ones." This sentence triggered every protective instinct inside me because this was no longer just a paranormal fear. My son was in real danger. "Why?" I asked. My father lowered his eyes. "Because they are necessary for the gateway." These words made the silence in the room even heavier because none of us knew exactly what it meant, but it was terrifying enough. "Alina," I said, "we aren't staying here tonight." But the moment I said that, my father sharply raised his head. "You're too late," he said. There was such a tone of finality in that sentence that a weight settled in my stomach. "What do you mean we're too late?" I asked. My father looked at the window. "They have seen you," he said. "Once they see you, they won't let you go." That moment, a long sound like metal scraping came from outside, as if someone were dragging their nails across iron. Daniel buried his head in Alina's shoulder in fear, but raised it again a few seconds later because he was listening. Children sometimes feel more curiosity than fear, and this scared me even more because Daniel seemed to be trying to understand those sounds then. The sound of running came from behind the house. Not one person, multiple people. It was as if they were running with bare feet on the soil. My father immediately turned off the lamp completely, and the living room was plunged into darkness. Only a very faint moonlight entered from the edge of the window. We all stood silently because it was now certain that things were prowling around the house. After a while, the running sound stopped. Then, a shadow appeared in front of the window. It was in human shape but very tall, taller than normal. Its head reached the top part of the window and it was motionless. I couldn't see its face because it was pitch black outside, but I could feel that thing watching us. Alina held her breath. I couldn't even move, and at that moment, a child's laughter was heard from outside the glass. But this wasn't a normal laugh because it had an unsettling echo within it, as if several children were laughing together at the same time. My mother began to cry. "It has started," she said, trembling. "It started tonight." Just as she said that, footsteps came from upstairs again, but this time it didn't sound like a single person because multiple steps were heard. The old floorboards were creaking in different spots simultaneously, and this was impossible because no one was supposed to be upstairs. My father gripped the shotgun tightly. "The doors," he told me. I immediately ran to the kitchen and the back door because I was no longer thinking logically. I just wanted to protect my family. The moment I checked the back door, my hand froze because muddy water was seeping in through the gap under the door. At first, I thought it was rain, but then I looked at the shape of the mark on the floor. It was a footprint. But it wasn't like a human foot because the toes were longer than they should be. I slowly backed away, and at that moment, someone whispered from the other side of the door, "Adrian." The voice was my voice. The moment I heard my own voice from behind the door, every muscle in my body locked up because when a person hears their own voice from the outside, a part of the brain refuses to accept it, especially if that voice is on the other side of a door. For a few seconds, I couldn't even breathe because that voice belonged entirely to me. The same intonation, the same emphasis, even the way of breathing was the same. "Adrian." It said it more slowly this time, as if it were calling me outside. The long-toed footprint under the door moved slightly, and at that moment I realized it was really there because this was no longer an imagination or a fear. There was something right behind the door, and that thing was speaking like me. "Take your hand off the door," my father said suddenly, because he had noticed what I was doing. At that moment, I jumped back instinctively because I really was touching the doorknob without realizing it. This situation created a new fear inside me because that voice wasn't just scaring me. It was influencing me. I quickly returned to the living room. Alina panicked even more when she saw the expression on my face. "What happened?" she asked. But before I could answer, the thing outside spoke again. "Open the door." This sentence was said with my voice again, but there was a strange distortion at the end, as if a non-human mouth couldn't quite perfectly mimic the speech. Daniel suddenly raised his head and looked at the door. "That's not him," he said quietly. This statement silenced everyone in the room because it wasn't normal for a 3-year-old child to say this, but the scariest part was, Daniel had said it with total certainty. "What does he see?" Alina whispered to me, but I couldn't answer because I was thinking the same thing. The thing outside went silent for a few seconds then. It knocked on the door. But this wasn't like a human hand because the sound was very heavy, as if something large was slowly hitting the wood. The walls of the house even vibrated, and my mother covered her mouth to keep from screaming. Another blow came, then another. My father aimed the shotgun but didn't fire because he clearly didn't know if it would work or not. "What do they want?" I said angrily, because my fear was now giving way to desperation. My father answered with his eyes fixed on the door, "The child." The moment I heard that word, everything inside me changed because it was no longer about survival. It was about protecting my son. Alina understood this too, as she took Daniel in her arms and moved to the darkest corner of the room. Right at that moment, the footsteps from upstairs started again, but this time they were faster, as if people were running. Then a door slammed shut, and fine dust fell from the ceiling of the house. My father looked up in fear. "They got in," he said in a voice that was almost inaudible. "How?" I asked immediately because all the doors were locked, but the moment I asked the question, I actually knew the answer because these things weren't acting like humans. A door or a window was no barrier for them then. A child's voice came from upstairs, but this time it wasn't a single voice. Multiple children were speaking at the same time. "Mom, Dad, we're here." The voices were echoing inside the house, and the scariest part was, some of them sounded familiar. I suddenly remembered the names of the children who had gone missing in my childhood because I had heard their voices years ago. My father suddenly stood up. "They're distracting us," he said sharply. "The main one hasn't arrived yet." With this sentence, the knocking sound from outside stopped completely. Silence fell. But this silence wasn't peaceful because it felt like something was approaching then. Daniel suddenly stopped crying. This change was so abrupt that we all looked at him. His expression had gone blank. His eyes were locked on the living room door, and he didn't move at all for a few seconds. "Daniel," Alina said in fear. But my son didn't answer. He stood up very slowly, and he began walking toward the living room door. "Daniel," I shouted, but it was as if he didn't even hear me. His movements weren't normal because he wasn't walking. It was as if he were being summoned. Just as he approached the door, he stopped suddenly. Then he spoke in a very quiet voice. "He is calling me," he said. At that moment, the fear inside me reached its peak because this was no longer just an attack from the things outside. They were reaching my son. Alina ran and grabbed Daniel, but Daniel wouldn't take his eyes off the door. "Who is calling you, son?" she asked, trembling. Daniel was silent for a few seconds then. He smiled, but this wasn't his smile. The moment I saw that smile on Daniel's face, something inside me broke because a father cannot explain with words the feeling of seeing his own child not acting normal. At that moment, the thing standing in front of me was physically my son, but there was something foreign in his gaze. The moment Alina noticed this, she pulled Daniel into her arms, but Daniel was still looking at the door, not even blinking. "Daniel," Alina said in a trembling voice. "Look at me, honey," but my son didn't react. Then he spoke very slowly. "He is waiting behind the door," he said in a calm voice. There was a tone in this sentence that didn't belong to a 3-year-old child because he wasn't speaking as if he were scared, but as if he were certain, as if he could see the thing outside. My father, cursing, headed for the window and parted the curtain a few inches, but the moment he looked, his face went deathly pale. He immediately closed the curtain back up. "What happened?" I said sharply. My father couldn't speak for a few seconds because he was truly shaken. "He's gone," he said finally. This sentence should have brought relief, but it did the opposite because the thing outside being gone wasn't reassuring. It was worse because we no longer knew where it was. Right at that moment, a heavy creaking sound came from the ceiling. We all looked up. Something was walking upstairs, but it was no longer slow. The steps were irregular, as if someone were moving on all fours. The ceiling boards began to crack and the sound stopped right above the living room. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a thin black liquid dripped from the ceiling. Alina pulled back in fear because the liquid had fallen right next to Daniel. When I leaned down to look, I realized it wasn't water because it was very thick and smelled terrible, like something rotten. My mother began to cry. It started again. She was whispering constantly, "It started again tonight." My father suddenly turned to me. "Listen to me," he said sharply. "If you don't get out of here before morning, you will lose your son." This sentence echoed in my brain because the matter was now clear. These things wanted Daniel and our time was running out. "Why?" I shouted finally. "Why my son?" My father looked away because he knew the answer, and that answer wasn't going to please me. "Because you returned," he said quietly. This statement changed the atmosphere in the room because I was now at the center of the event. I realized that the thing I had been trying to escape since childhood hadn't let me go. "What does this mean?" I said, but a bad feeling was growing inside me. My father took a deep breath. "The same thing happened when you were born," he said. My heart felt like it was going to stop because I didn't expect this sentence at all. My mother covered her face because she clearly didn't want to tell this, but there was no time left to hide it. "The night you were born." My father said, 6 children went missing in the village. That moment my world was shaken because this was no longer just a horror story. It was connected to me. "That's nonsense," I said immediately, but even my voice didn't believe what I was saying. My father shook his head. "The elders of the village said you were marked." The moment I heard this word, all the strange events from my childhood began to make sense because people had always treated me differently. Some avoided touching me, some wouldn't look into my eyes. For years I had thought it was just the quirkiness of the village people, but now it had another meaning. "Why did you send me away?" I asked. My father closed his eyes because they said if we kept you here, everyone would die. That moment I looked at my mother because the guilt on her face confirmed everything. They had removed me from the village, not to get me away, but to protect me, or maybe to protect the village from me. As I was thinking about this, Daniel suddenly spoke. "He's coming down," he said. His voice was like a whisper, but we all heard it then. A heavy crawling sound came from the upper floor. This time it wasn't the sound of footsteps. Something was crawling down the stairs. The wooden steps began to creak one by one. The first step, the second, the third. None of us were moving because fear can sometimes completely paralyze a person. That was exactly what I was experiencing. My eyes were locked on the stairs. Then a long, thin hand appeared out of the darkness. The fingers weren't like a human's because they were much longer than they should be, and the joints were bending in the opposite direction. The hand gripped the step. Then the second hand came then. Its face appeared. And at that moment, Alina screamed because the face of the thing crawling down the stairs was my face. The moment I saw the face of the thing crawling down the stairs, my brain refused to accept it because when a human sees their own face on another creature, their sense of reality shatters. For a few seconds, I couldn't move because that thing didn't just look like me. It was identical. The same hair, the same eyes, the same jawline, but with one difference. There was no humanity in its eyes. They were completely black. Alina grabbed Daniel and backed away, but she couldn't take her eyes off that thing because although the creature standing before us looked human, its movements were definitely not. As it descended the stairs, its joints twisted in reverse directions and its neck turned more than normal, as if it were being controlled by something that had just learned to inhabit a human body. My mother began to pray. My father aimed the shotgun, but he didn't fire because he was afraid. And at that moment, I understood why. When the thing in front of you carries your own face, pulling the trigger isn't easy. When the creature reached the last step, it remained motionless for a few seconds. Then very slowly, it tilted its head to the side and looked at me. There was no anger in its gaze. There was something worse, a sense of recognition. It was as if it had known me for years. Then it spoke. Adrian, the voice was mine again. But it came from deeper within, as if several people were speaking at once. Alina and the child, it said. With that sentence, the fear inside me gave way to pure rage because now my only thought was protecting my family. Get the hell out, I shouted, but even my voice was trembling. That thing smiled slightly. And at that exact moment, my father pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded inside the house. Alina screamed. Daniel began to cry, but what truly froze me was the creature didn't fall. The bullet had hit its chest, but it stood there as if nothing had happened. Then very slowly it bowed its head and looked at its chest, and it laughed. It wasn't a human laugh because other voices were inside it. Women's voices, children's voices, and the whispers of old people were all mingling together. My father fired a second time. This time the creature's shoulder was shattered, but a few seconds later the flesh began to move again. Black veins twisted inside the wound and the flesh began to close. Seeing this, I realized it wasn't a living being. It was something else. Alina, I shouted, go to the back door, but just as we were about to move, all the lights in the house began to flicker. Then whispers were heard from the corners of the living room. At first they were very faint, but within seconds they multiplied. Adrian, Adrian, Adrian. The voices were coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the ceiling, from inside the house. Daniel covered his ears and began to cry because the whispers no longer sounded like normal human voices. It was as if dozens of mouths were speaking at once. The creature took a step, and at that moment the air in the room turned ice cold. My breath became visible because the living room had suddenly chilled. My mother collapsed to the floor because she could no longer stand from fear. We're too late, she said, weeping. They chose him. Hearing those words, a new fear formed inside me because when my mother said him, she seemed to mean me. Not Daniel, the creature spoke without taking its eyes off me. You returned, it said. That is why the door opened. This sentence echoed in my brain because I realized that the thing I had been running from for years had never actually let us go. I had only delayed the time. What do you want? I shouted. The smile on the creature's face grew. You, it said. This answer silenced everything for a few seconds because I wasn't expecting it. I had thought all night that they wanted Daniel, but at that moment I realized my son was just bait. The real target was me. Just as I was thinking this, the sound of a bell was heard from outside. It was the bell of the old church, but it hadn't worked for years. My father's face completely collapsed the moment he heard that sound. He said in a whisper, "The ritual has begun." That moment, shouts began to come from outside because people were gathering in the village square. When I approached the window and looked, the sight I saw was something I would never forget for the rest of my life. The village people were kneeling in the square. They were all looking in the same direction, toward our house, and they were all whispering at once. Smiling Eye Part 4 ***. The moment I saw the people kneeling in the village square, I realized that the fear I had felt throughout my childhood but never fully understood was real. These people weren't praying or asking for help. They were waiting for something, and that thing was inside our house. Worse, that thing carried my face. I stood frozen in front of the window because the scene outside was not something logic could accept. Old women were crying, men had their heads bowed, some had their hands raised in the air, but none were trying to flee. It was as if a moment they had been waiting for years had finally arrived. "Adrian," Alina said in a trembling voice, "we have to get out of here." She was right, but I didn't know how we would get out because the thing standing inside the house was watching us, or rather, it was watching me. It wouldn't even take its eyes off me. Then the creature spoke again. "They gave you back," it said. This sentence created another fear inside me because at that moment, I felt there was a greater hidden truth about my childhood. I slowly turned to my father because I wanted answers now. "What do you mean, gave me back?" I asked. My father couldn't speak for a few seconds because the expression on his face was like the weight of a crime he had carried for years. My mother continued to cry. Finally, my father raised his head. "When you were born," he said slowly, "the elders in the village wanted us to kill you." This sentence exploded inside me because I never thought I would hear it. Alina looked at me in shock, but I just watched my father because I had to hear the rest. I asked. My father lowered his eyes. "Because you were marked," he said. "The night you were born, the tunnels under the cemetery opened." With these words, forgotten images began to come alive in my mind. As a child, I would see long shadows standing in front of my window on certain nights. My mother would spray salt in my room while praying. Sometimes when I woke up in the morning, there would be mud under my bed, but my family never explained any of it. "Why didn't you kill me?" I asked. My father looked into my eyes. "Because your mother wouldn't let us," he said. My mother began to sob because the fear she had carried for years had completely surfaced. "We took you away," she said with a trembling voice. "We thought if we moved you far from the village, they would forget you. But they hadn't forgotten, they had just waited, and now I was back." The creature took a few more steps. As it moved, creaks came from its joints. The human body didn't seem to fit it quite right. Then it turned its head toward Daniel. "Your son," it said. "He will open the door completely." The moment I heard this sentence, my fear turned back to my son because now the situation wasn't just about me. Daniel was part of this thing's plan too. "Alina, take Daniel and go to the car," I said sharply. But Alina didn't move because the sounds from outside had grown closer. The village people were now wandering around the house. Shadows passed in front of the windows and they were all whispering the same thing. "Open the door, open the door, open the door." These voices had become rhythmic enough to hypnotize a person. A few seconds later, I noticed that Daniel had also begun repeating the same sentence between his lips. "Open the door." "Alina," I shouted, because my son's eyes had begun to change. His pupils were larger than normal, and it was as if he wasn't looking at the room, but somewhere else. My mother suddenly got up and ran to the kitchen. A few seconds later, she returned with a small, old cross. She tried to put the cross around Daniel's neck, but Daniel suddenly screamed. He screamed so loud that we all recoiled because that voice was not the voice of a 3-year-old child. And at that moment, all the windows of the house shattered at once. The whispers outside suddenly went silent. There was total silence. This silence lasted a few seconds then. Something heavy was heard walking outside. Asterisk thump, asterisk asterisk thump, asterisk asterisk thump. Asterisk the steps were very heavy, as if something massive were moving across the ground. The village people had also gone completely silent at that moment because even they were afraid. The smile on the creature's face grew. "It has arrived," it said. With that single word, an indescribable dread formed inside me because I realized that even the things we had encountered until a moment ago were afraid of something larger. Asterisk thump, asterisk asterisk thump, asterisk asterisk thump, asterisk the steps stopped in front of the house. Then, long black fingers were placed very slowly onto the top part of the door. The door was nearly 2 meters high, but those fingers reached the top edge easily. Alina began to cry. My father dropped the shotgun because his hands were shaking. I couldn't even move because my mind was trying to imagine the size of the thing on the other side of the door. And then, the sound of a deep breath came from outside the door. That breath from the other side of the door was not like a human breath because it came from very deep within, as if it were coming not from lungs, but from an empty well. For a few seconds, we all remained motionless because our brains were trying to imagine the owner of that voice, but none of us really wanted to see it. Asterisk thump. Asterisk asterisk thump. Asterisk the wood of the door bent slightly inward because the thing outside was only touching it, but even that touch was enough to crack the old timber. Daniel suddenly raised his head and looked at the door. There was no fear in his eyes anymore. This scared me more because when children stop being afraid, it is a bad sign. He is calling me, he said again in that same calm voice. Alina, hold him, I shouted because Daniel had begun walking slowly toward the door. Alina immediately held our son, but Daniel was acting incredibly strong. Not like a 3-year-old child, it was as if something else were pulling him. The thing outside the door breathed again, then it spoke. But this speech was not like a language, it was more like dozens of people whispering at once. And despite that, I understood what it said. Open the door. This word echoed inside my brain because the voice felt like it was heard by my mind, not my ears. My mother screamed and collapsed to the floor. My father began to pray because he had heard the same thing. The creature was still standing in front of the stairs, smiling while keeping its black eyes on me. There is no choice anymore, it said. At that exact moment, the thing outside struck the door. This time, the whole house shook. Plaster fell from the walls, the lamps on the ceiling exploded, and the living room was plunged into total darkness. Alina screamed because Daniel was trying to break free from her arms. I immediately held my son, but his skin was ice cold. Dad, Daniel said. His voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. There are people behind the door. This sentence created a new fear inside me because whatever the thing outside was, it wasn't alone. My father suddenly turned to me. To the cemetery, he said sharply. I shouted because I no longer understood anything. Because the seal is there, he said. If it breaks, they will all pass through. With those words, another memory from my childhood returned to my mind because I had been trying to forget the old stone door behind the cemetery for years. As a child, I had heard crying sounds coming from there one night, and the next day, no one in the village had spoken all day long. Am I going to stop this? I said. Before my father could answer, the thing outside struck a second time. This time the top part of the door broke. One of the long black fingers entered. The finger was as long as a human arm and had a pitch-black cracked surface instead of skin. As it moved, it made creaking sounds like the sound of bone. Alina began to cry hysterically because that thing was now getting inside. Daniel, meanwhile, suddenly became calm. Then he smiled. He's here, he said like a happy child. That sight destroyed me because my own son was no longer afraid. He was glad. Right at that moment, the creature moved. It left the front of the stairs and began walking toward me. With every step, its body seemed to distort. Sometimes its neck lengthened. Sometimes its arms grew more than normal, as if it were struggling to keep its true form under its human shape. We have waited for you for years, it said. You are the door. With that sentence, a violent pain started in my brain because all the nightmares I had seen throughout my childhood returned: dark tunnels, black-eyed people, voices whispering under the cemetery. These weren't random, they were all connected to me. What do you want from me? I shouted. The creature stopped a few inches in front of me and spoke very quietly. We came to take you the night you were born, it said, but your mother hid you. Mother began to cry because this was true. Now you have returned, the creature said, and your son will open the door completely. That moment, the thing outside struck the door a third time. The door split in two, cold air rushed in, and from within the darkness 2 giant black eyes appeared. The 2 giant black eyes visible behind the broken part of the door were like nothing I had seen in my life, because there wasn't a single human emotion in those eyes. There was no anger, no mercy, and no hunger. There was only a sense of infinite void, and when that void looked at you, you realized how small your own existence was. For a few seconds, no one could move because our brains were trying to grasp the magnitude of that thing. The remaining part of the door slowly bent inward. The wood cracked, and the thing outside tilted its head slightly and began to look into the house. I couldn't see its face clearly because the darkness hid it, but its height was way above the door. It almost touched the ceiling. Its long black arms reached to the floor, and as it moved, the air inside the house grew even colder. Daniel suddenly tried to break free from my arms. "I have to go," he said calmly. The moment I heard those words, the fear inside me turned completely into rage because now that thing was touching my son's mind. I held Daniel tightly, but my son wasn't even crying, he just wanted to go to the door. "Alina," I shouted, "run to the car." This time Alina didn't hesitate. She took Daniel because she realized that if we stayed here, we would die. Just as we headed for the back door, the creature in front of the stairs moved suddenly. It didn't run like a human, it suddenly elongated. Its arms touched the floor, and it pounced on us like a spider. My father pulled the trigger, but although the bullet shattered the creature's face, it didn't stop it. The creature slammed into my father and they both were thrown against the wall. My mother screamed because a horrific cracking sound came from my father's neck. "Father," I shouted, but he didn't answer. The creature turned its head back to me, and this time the skin on its face began to open slowly. Underneath, there was no human face. There was a moving black void, as if darkness lived inside its face. Alina, weeping, opened the back door and we all rushed out. The village was plunged into total darkness, but the people in the square were still kneeling. None of them helped us because they had already surrendered. The moment I tried to open the car door, I noticed something. The village people weren't looking at us anymore. They were all looking at Daniel. And in their faces, there was more expectation than fear. Right at that moment, a long howl was heard from the direction of the cemetery. It was as if it were coming from under the ground, and the whole village began to shake. People began to cry at the same time because they too knew what it meant. "The cemetery," my mother said, running behind us. "The door is opening." The creature came out of the house. I could see its full height now. It had completely abandoned its human form because its body was constantly moving, elongating, and twisting. Its eyes were locked directly onto Daniel. Then, the village people began to speak at the same time. "Give him up, give him up, give him up." This voice turned into a terrifying howl formed by hundreds of people whispering at once. Alina was crying hysterically because Daniel was no longer looking at us, but at the cemetery. "Dad," my son said in a very calm voice, "people are crying there." That moment, I realized I had to make a decision because even if we fled, they wouldn't leave us alone. It wasn't just about tonight. As long as I was alive, my son would never be safe. I remembered what my father had said. The seal is at the cemetery. There truly was a seal. I had to close it. "Alina," I said, trembling, "take Daniel and leave the village, no matter what." Nodded, but there was something more than fear in her eyes because she understood what I was thinking of doing. She said, weeping. But I didn't listen to her. I began to run toward the cemetery. The creature's scream came from behind me because it understood what I wanted to do. As I ran on the stone roads of the village, all the fears of my childhood returned. People were kneeling by the roadside looking at me, but none moved. They were as if they were already dead. When I reached the cemetery, I saw that the old stone door was open. For the first time in my life, it was open. And black smoke was coming from inside. The ground was shaking. Whispers were now coming from everywhere. The moment I approached the door, hundreds of voices began to speak inside my mind because those things were calling me. I realized that the person they had been waiting for years was me. Then, heavy steps came from behind me. The creature had caught up to me. "It's too late," it said, but for the first time. I wasn't afraid because I had finally understood the truth. I was their door, and the only way to close this door was to destroy me. I slowly looked at the creature, then at the darkness under the cemetery, and I let myself fall in. At that moment, a horrific scream echoed throughout the village because the things under the ground had begun to shout at once. The world shook, and as the stone door closed over me, the last thing I saw was Alina running toward me from afar. Then, everything went dark. According to police reports, a massive fire broke out in the village that night, and the village was completely evacuated. However, in official records, neither Adrian's body was found nor were the majority of the village people seen again. As for Alina, in her statement given years later, she explained that for weeks after that night, her son said the same sentence in his sleep. "Father is still down there."